You are on 666. It is 2:30. It's Barry York. We had spent a fantastic hour with him recently in Canberra Close Up as he was signing off from the Museum of Australian Democracy as a full-time oral historian. He's still at his work, though, and he's going to bring us in some beautiful migrant voices that he has recorded over the years, some great stories. So Barry York will join me. And not so long ago, Barry York was signing off in the full-time capacity as an oral historian at the Museum of Australian Democracy. He's worked at the National Library, at the ANU. But Barry, you've got an enormous amount of material and work that is really interesting to hear, and it's so great to see you this afternoon.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah. And so what have you brought in today?
I've brought in some excerpts from oral history interviews documenting the migrant experience, particularly Maltese migrants, who I've had an interest in because my dad was Maltese. I started recording oral histories in 1984, and that meant that I could interview people who had come here before World War One. Even, they were in their late 70s at the time, but I did record a few people in that category. And it dawned on me recently that means that among my collection, some of which is digitised and held at the National Library, that you can hear the voices of migrants of a vintage of over 100 years ago. Makes me feel old, Alex, but from a historical point of view, it's just, if I say so myself, it's wonderful material to have.
Isn't that just, that's a treasure?
It really is. And over the past 30 years or so, I've ended up recording probably over 300 migrants of different backgrounds, mainly Maltese, Polish, and scatterings of other Italians and English migrants over that period. And with each interview, I've adopted the same approach, which is to ask about their background in their homeland, the reasons for migration. There's always the push factor and the pull factor, what attracted them to Australia, and their settlement experiences. Oh yes, and the voyage, because nearly all of them came by boat. And that in itself is fascinating today when hardly anybody migrates by boat except for very poor people who have to flee their homeland.
And it's been a bit of a theme because this time yesterday I was talking to Michael Simic, whose dad was Croatian, and he met Michael's mum here in Canberra. But he talked about his dad being quite tortured for a way in terms of leaving his country. And then finally, when he went back, he was at peace with it all. And it sort of fits with your theme of, that having to leave for whatever reasons, whether it's revolution or war or whatever, and then leaving so much behind and being torn.
Often, in the case of the people that I've interviewed, it tends to be the kind of, a desire to escape a war-torn environment, but also the idea that Australia was, as my Maltese grandmother used to call it, the land of the future. That's how they referred to it apparently in Malta back then. And so there was this idea that you could have a better life away from the memories of the Second World War. That didn't apply to the very early people that I interviewed, like those who came here prior to World War One. Even that was different again. That was usually the man of the family seeking better employment and a better standard of living, making the journey on his own, establishing himself here after a year or two, and then sending for his wife and any children. And among the excerpts that I've brought in, there's one with a woman who came here in 1914, Jean Barrett, originally Jean Rizzo, whose father did precisely that. He went to Tasmania, where there were a couple of hundred Maltese in 1912 working for the Mount Lyell Mining Company. he didn't like it there. It was dank and wet, and so he headed up to Sydney and settled at Woolloomooloo, and then brought his wife and daughter Jean to Woolloomooloo in 1914.
In the early years of 1912, he decided that he'd like to try and come to another country. So he found a ship that he'd done a working passage on it, and it came out, but he didn't know that he was going to Tasmania. But it landed him in Tasmania. He didn't even know where Tasmania was in the world. But after he was working on, he was sleeping in tents, and they were road making in Tasmania. But between 1912 and 1914, he found a way of bringing my mother and myself here. And we arrived here in June 1914, the last German ship to bring out passengers before the war. When he came to Sydney, he was earning £2.10 a week in wages. He joined the Wharf Labourers Union here, stevedoring they call it, down in Woolloomooloo, unloading and loading the ships. And he'd done that for the rest of his life.
His intention all along, was it to bring his family
Oh yeah,
out?
bring out here and make a better living for us, that's right, because my mother had to work in Malta to make two ends meet, as the saying is.
What are your earlier recollections of...
Well, we came straight to Woolloomooloo in Nicholson Street. My father rented a place there, 12 and 6 a week, 2 rooms upstairs and 2 down, because nobody had a lounge suite them days. It was a dining room and a kitchen and bedrooms. And my mother started sewing. My father started to bring home £2.10 a week, and they thought they were quite comfortable. And things were different. Even, she could go to the shops and buy meat more often than she could in Malta. A lot of things like that. She never wanted to go back. She died at the age of 83, and she never went back to Malta.
Never wanted to go back.
No, yes, well...
And I was just listening to that saying, just had the 2 rooms, you didn't have lounge rooms then. And that's probably, why still in Australia we call it the good room.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
That sort of extra luxury room, the good room, because that was luxurious, wasn't it, to have that kind of space?
Yeah. And as she said, they felt that they were doing well here. Her father worked on the waterfront at a time of great economic boom in terms of trade. The Woolloomooloo Wharf was a new wharf, the Finger Wharf, and we were exporting to Europe, not just Britain at that time. And later in that interview, I haven't brought in another excerpt, but the whole interview goes for over an hour, but she talks about living near the wharf, as they did, and how there were horses everywhere. She said hundreds of horses, and horses were the main form of transport. They'd be carrying the cargo or unloading it from the ships.
That gives Woolloomooloo a different atmosphere, doesn't it?
Yeah, well...
having horses around.
Listening to that interview, you really conjure up an image of what it was like, and she even says how the Maltese men and some of the Italian fishermen who were there at night, they'd be sitting on their doorsteps because there are no front yards in the houses in that area, as they would have in Malta. They sit on the front step playing a mandolin or having a smoke and just chatting to whoever walked by.
The neighbourhood.
And you hear it in her own words as somebody who grew up there from 1914.
Dr. Barry York is my guest this afternoon, 19 to 3, 10 degrees in town, bringing us migrant voices in this multicultural nation.
I did a lot of travel in recording and collecting these stories. The one we just heard was recorded on my General Electric portable cassette recorder in the days when I was too poor to have any good equipment, But the National Library digitised it, and it's now part of their collection. I've travelled to Mackay in Queensland, to Tasmania, to western suburbs of Melbourne and Sydney, and on one occasion I drove out to Broken Hill, where there was a Maltese community who mainly worked in the mines and had come out in the 1920s. And the next excerpt that I've brought in is with Paul Sultana, who came from Malta in 1925, worked in the mines, and he came on a French boat at a time when some of the boats didn't have refrigeration. And he went to Marseille in France from Malta, caught the boat there, and as you will hear, he talks about how the ship provided fresh meat for the passengers, given that they didn't have refrigeration. This is 1925 he's talking about.
We went from Malta to Marseille. We stayed there 3 days. We bought the ship Villa de Strasbourg, and we took 45 days to get to Fremantle. We landed Fremantle in All Saints' Day, and we come from there, and all this ship, everywhere you go, you load, I think, unload stuff, you know. It's half merchant ship and half passengers, see? And in them days, there's no refrigeration. And as I told you, we have 2 bullocks on the deck and half a dozen pigs and chooks, you know, and all sorts of pigeons, you know, for the French cooking. And I seen him killing these blooming bullocks. We always go watch him. There's a butcher or slaughterman, I don't know what they call it anyway. And this butcher, he used to put a punch in his brains between his horns and hit him with the blooming hammer. Great big hammer, plump, and the bullet down. Poor old soul on his back. Same as the pig. And the pig used to yell out. The pig's big when he catches him with the leg, and oh, Jesus, we used to laugh.
So then, after he killed the bull, or the pig, he slaughtered it on the deck?
Yeah, he skinned it on there and all that, cut it to pieces. I don't know what's happened. He cooked it. Otherwise, because we used to get the blooming meat, you could smell it a mile away. It stinks like hell. We had to eat it. Starving. Either that or you eat the oats.
And then wash the deck down with the hose?
Oh, yeah, they used to wash the decks and all.
Thank goodness for that. Oh, well, that's the way it was.
Yeah, 1925.
We're assuming the French cook did nose to tail. The poor old bullock and the poor old pig. Yeah.
And in the background, I mean, the beauty of oral history is that it's sound archiving, really. We're not just interested in the information, but the voice itself and the way it's conveyed and expressed. And in the 2 excerpts so far, you hear very different voices, very different accents. And in the background of the one with Mr. Sultana, you would have heard a canary chirping.
I did.
And that's a very Maltese custom with the Maltese men of that generation, whether in Australia or in Malta. The main hobby is aviaries. They love their birds, you know. When I've been back to Malta or visiting cousins in the western suburbs of Melbourne, quite often the man will have his aviary, which he's very proud of, or the prized canary in the inside the house, you know, that has pride of place.
So you're delighted to catch his voice with that background because it's
and often that happens
representative
with different background noises. So it gets back to that idea of creating a record that is based on sound, the voice and the context.
Dr. Barry York is my guest this afternoon. Next, Barry.
I thought I would bring in a couple of excerpts of my parents.
Oh, how gorgeous.
Loreto York. He changed his name from Malak, which was his Maltese original name. He changed it before I was born. While he was stationed in London with the Royal Air Force, he joined up in Malta, served around Africa and the Middle East during World War II. That had nothing to go back to in Malta. His parents were killed and, you know, Malta was devastated by the war. So he remained in London with the Air Force, and he ended up getting a position, a desk job with the Air Ministry while in the Air Force. It meant that a whole new world was open to him of the theatres of the West End of London, because servicemen would get free tickets and go there. He loved London. He loved the cosmopolitan nature of it. The big city life was so different to what he grew up with in Malta, which tended to be a village society. Anyway, we migrated when I was 3 years old from London to Australia, to Melbourne. And the excerpt I've chosen of my father sort of shows how not all migrants regarded Australia as God's own country. It's a bit of a myth. People think everyone was coming here and, wow, we're so better off. And because he'd worked in London, he thought Melbourne would be a smaller version of London. In this excerpt, he begins by talking about the day we disembarked, and his brother Joe, who was working on the waterfront in Melbourne, picked us up, and they provided accommodation in West Melbourne in the Maltese community there.
Do you remember much about that day? Can you visualise the day?
No, I could remember seeing them on the boat. They came on the boat, then we came down, and we went into the car, and they drove us to their house in West Melbourne, which I was disgusted with the place. It was small, it was next to a factory, and it wasn't with a big garden at the back, which one expect, and definitely they didn't even have a front garden in the front. So I was very disappointed in the locality of the house, in the house itself, and also in the crudeness of speaking, come here, They fed us well, they looked after us well, it's no two ways about it. But remember, I was spoiled in London at the Air Ministry. So of course, you mix in with those people, and then you come out here. It's a big contrast, because people were, I must say, in my opinion, very rough and very crude in a lot of ways.
Telling it like it is.
Yeah,
well, like as he perceived it, yeah.
Again, the voice itself can say so much, because my father had a slight Maltese accent, but he always tried, he believed that the better you could speak English,
it's very genteel,
the
isn't it?
more you would advance. And when I was growing up in Brunswick, we were Brunswick people, and of course you drop your H's and all that, drop your G's, and my dad would get very angry. He'd say, speak English properly, he'd be really strict about it. And he always tried to speak properly, and he had high expectations, he wanted to improve. And this is what migrants do, why migration's such an important and good thing.
You're a doctorate in history. You have a history doctorate. I mean,
it can be replicated with so many others, that we come here to do better. You don't spend 6 weeks on the boat, leaving family and the familiar behind in order to, she'll be right, And my father definitely had that attitude, and so did my mother. And I've chosen an excerpt from my interview with her as an example of how, we always talk about how migration changes the society that they come to, as Australia was changed by mass migration after the war. But the other side to that coin is how individuals are changed by coming here. And so I've got a brief excerpt here of my mother talking about that. Olive, her name was. How do you think Australia has changed you, Bertha?
Oh, very much. Very much. I was very nervous. I was born in the middle of a Zeppelin air raid in 1916 during the First World War, which left me a very nervy individual. And I missed out a lot on life in England through being so nervous. Scared to do this, scared to do that. But since I've lived in Australia, I've realised how I've lost my nerves completely. I can talk to anybody. I can really enjoy life now. And I'm not frightened of this, I'm not frightened of that. As a matter of fact, I've often wondered if I've gone too much the opposite way.
And do you think if you stayed in England you wouldn't have developed
I
in
would
that
still
way?
been the shy person I was and go red as soon as anybody talked to me, and I lost a lot in my early years by being so nervous.
I just wonder why that is, though. Do you have any ideas on why Australia would have that effect?
I think it was because realising I'd come to another country to make a different life for myself. I thought, well, I've got to get out of this. I'm not enjoying life to the full. I've got to get out of my nerves, and I'm sure it was through talking to myself about it. Nobody else really can help you. You have to do it yourself.
But what was it about Australia that...
Well, if I'd gone to
encouraged
another
you?
country, I think I would have been the same.
But
It's just leaving my homeland.
Great interview.
Yeah.
Dr. Barry York, and that was his mother.
Yes, and those interviews with my mother and my father, they go for many hours. They were recorded over many sessions. The one with my mother is wonderful as an account of working class life in northwest London from 1916 through the Depression, the Blitz in the Second World War. She was in the middle of that. And then, of course, the whole thing about migrating and the settlement experiences here.
And you've got one last.
Yes, when I was a historian at the Museum of Australian Democracy at Old Parliament House, we had an oral history program, and we had a project with the National Library where we interviewed former federal parliamentarians. And it was a great pleasure for me to interview Michael McKellar, the late Michael McKellar, who was Minister for Immigration and Ethnic Affairs from 1975 to 79, when the Vietnamese were being brought in by Malcolm Fraser. It was very controversial at the time. And Michael McKellar had this lovely anecdote about how he kept his spirits going through a particular photo in his office when he was receiving a lot of flack for his pro-Vietnam policy.
There's one thing I'd say about the immigration area, which I don't know whether I've said it before, but it's absolutely true. Decisions you take in relation to population and immigration, you can alter just about every other decision of government. But if you have an immigration program and a population program, and you make decisions in that area, you cannot alter it. What you are doing is bringing about a fundamental change in the Australian community. The fact that we allowed hundreds of thousands of refugees or quasi-refugees or asylum seekers into the place over a number of years has fundamentally altered the composition of the Australian community and the way we live our lives. If you make a decision in immigration, you can't change that. So that's what I sort of experienced, and when I look back at my parliamentary career, there are many things that I would have done differently, but was it worthwhile? I think yes, in many ways it was. There's a marvellous photograph of a little Vietnamese boy who arrived with the first group that came out. He was in Melbourne Airport. I remember seeing him. He was standing there, had just arrived in the place in the first flight. And I don't know what happened to this kid, but there he was standing there in a little smock, looking as attractive as only little Asian kids can. And so when things got really bad, I used to look at this photograph and think to myself, well, I gave him a chance. And I think if you can do that as a politician, or as a member of parliament, look back on where you've made a difference to some people's life in a positive way, then I think you've done your job.
Gee, really interesting to know where that child is now.
Yes. Again, with Michael
Affirm to him what he was doing was right.
Yep. And with that interview, it went over many sessions and ended up being 8 or 9 hours. I also recorded another former Minister for Immigration, Chris Herford, for the Museum and the National Library. In all, the Museum of Australian Democracy and the National Library project, we ended up, when I left, we had over 100 interviews with former federal parliamentarians, which I felt quite happy
What a
about.
fantastic resource. Yeah, that is such a... Barry, great to see you. You're going to come back more, aren't you?
Well, I'd like to.
I've got all
Thanks
this.
for having me. Yes.
Well, I know you brought some music in, but I think Adam Shirley is sidling alongside you.
We'll see
you. We'll see you again soon. Thank you so much.
No,
It was
thank
just
you.
wonderful. We'll talk again
Appreciate
soon.
it. Thank you.